What if awakening doesn't make you happier, just more alone? You start noticing the conversations that go nowhere, the rituals that feel hollow, the crowds that worship comfort while calling it meaning. You used to belong. Now you just observe from somewhere deeper, quieter, lonelier. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he forgot to add, the cost is everything that isn't you. Jung understood this intimately. Individuation requires self-sufficiency, independence of mind, and the ability to stand apart from the crowd and go our own way. Throughout his life, loneliness emerged as a constantly recurring theme at all significant points, not as a pathology, but as an inevitable consequence of consciousness itself. Today, we're exploring one of the most uncomfortable truths about personal growth, that the journey toward becoming whole often means becoming isolated, that seeing clearly frequently means standing alone. That consciousness has a price, and that price is paid in the currency of belonging. This is the story of what happens when you wake up in a world that's still dreaming. The moment everything changes. There's a moment in every person's journey, a precise instant when something fundamental shifts. You can't name it at first. You can't even be sure it's real, but something has irrevocably changed in how you perceive the world. It might happen at a party where you suddenly hear the conversations as if for the first time. Not the words themselves, but their function, the performance of it all, the careful dance of egos protecting themselves, seeking validation, avoiding anything real, or perhaps it's at work. When you realize the meeting could have been an email, the project serves no real purpose and everyone knows it, but no one says it. The collective agreement to pretend becomes suddenly painfully visible. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming conscious, which requires the ability to stand apart from the crowd. But what he described in clinical terms feels, in lived experience, like a rupture, a tearing away from something you didn't even know you were attached to. The veil lifts. What's actually happening in this moment is that you're seeing through the social contract, not the explicit one, the laws, the rules, the formal structures, but the invisible one, the one that says pretend you don't notice the emptiness, act like the rituals have meaning, participate in the collective illusion, because everyone's happiness depends on it. These rituals aren't inherently meaningless, but for many people they've become performances disconnected from any authentic inner experience. They're shells, beautiful, elaborate shells, but shells nonetheless, and once you see the shell, you can't unsee it. Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon. He spent years working to prevent his conscious mind from blocking out what his unconscious mind wanted to show him. What he discovered in that process, documented in his Red Book, was that consciousness doesn't arrive as enlightenment or bliss. It arrives as burden, the first cost, comfort. The first thing you lose is comfort. Not physical comfort necessarily, but psychological comfort. The comfort of not questioning. The comfort of fitting in without trying. The comfort of assuming that everyone else sees what you see and feels what you feel. You're sitting at a family dinner, and everyone's talking about the same things they always talk about. The weather, the neighbors, some celebrity scandal, and you realize, with a clarity that feels almost violent, that no one is saying what they actually mean. No one is acknowledging the elephant in the room, whatever it might be. Maybe it's the family dysfunction. Maybe it's someone's addiction. Maybe it's just the crushing ordinariness of it all, and you have a choice. You can speak your truth and shatter the illusion, becoming the problem, the troublemaker, the one who takes things too seriously. Or you can stay silent and feel the growing chasm between your inner reality and your outer performance. Either way, comfort is gone. The exile begins. Jung experienced the isolation that comes with greater consciousness, with knowing more than those around him. This isn't arrogance, it's not superiority. It's the simple, painful fact that once you've seen certain truths, you exist in a different reality than those who haven't. You're still in the same room, still at the same job, still in the same relationships. But you're no longer truly present in the shared reality. You've been exiled, not by others, but by your own awareness. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. This is the first shock of seeing, recognizing that the price of awareness is belonging, that you cannot have both complete honesty and complete comfort in a world built on necessary illusions. But this is only the beginning. The shock of seeing is just the first stage of a much longer, lonelier journey. The ancient pattern. If you're experiencing this isolation, you're not the first. You're participating in one of humanity's oldest patterns, what Jung would call an archetype, the exile, the hermit, the one who sees differently and must therefore stand apart. Throughout human history and across cultures, the journey toward higher consciousness has always involved separation from the collective. The hero must cross a threshold, the boundary between waking consciousness and the vast sea of the unconscious. This crossing leads to the shadowy kingdom, often depicted in mythology as the underworld. But we've romanticized this journey. We've turned it into hero narratives where the separation is temporary, the lessons are clear, and the return is triumphant. The reality is far less cinematic and far more isolating. The weight of the shadow, Jung, recognized that anyone brave enough to withdraw all their projections becomes conscious of a pretty thick shadow. Such a person has saddled himself with new problems and conflicts. He has become a serious problem to himself. This is what makes the exile so profound. You're not just separated from others. You're separated from your own comfortable self-image. The person you thought you were dissolves. The values you inherited without questioning reveal themselves as hollow. The identity you built over decades of conditioning begins to crack. The shadow implies the unseen, hiding where the light of consciousness has not yet shined. Shadow work makes these unseen parts of yourself seen. You look at photos of yourself from years ago and barely recognize that person. Not because you've physically changed, but because you see the performance now. You see yourself playing a role, wearing a persona, desperately trying to be acceptable to people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered so much. The loneliness of authenticity. Here's what no one tells you about becoming authentic. It makes you unintelligible to people who are still performing. Your words carry different weight. Your concerns seem strange. Your priorities appear selfish or incomprehensible. You try to explain what you're experiencing, the sense of seeing through social facades, the inability to participate in shallow rituals, the need for genuine connection over comfortable companionship. But the words land wrong. You sound pretentious or depressed or like you think you're better than everyone else. You're not trying to be superior. You're just trying to be honest. But loneliness doesn't come from having no people about you. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you, or from holding certain views which others find inadmissible. This is the unique torture of the exile. You're surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. You speak the same language but mean different things. You share the same space but inhabit different worlds. The hermit's path. In 1923, Jung began building his tower, a solitary retreat on the shores of Lake Zurich where he went for renewal and repose. He built the house in sections, adding the last in 1955 in response to his wife's death. Jung said the house was a representation in stone of his innermost thoughts and of the knowledge he had acquired. He needed physical exile to match his psychological exile. He needed a place where his inner reality and outer environment could align. Most of us can't build literal towers, but we create metaphorical ones. We carve out spaces, physical, temporal, or digital, where we can exist without performance, where we can think thoughts that wouldn't be acceptable in polite company, where we can be honest about our observations without social consequence. The misunderstood prophet. The exile archetype often merges with the prophet, the one who sees what others cannot or will not see and must speak it, even knowing the message won't be welcomed. Jung's hero doesn't reflect our culture's image of the hero. Their courage is moral rather than physical. Their bravery is the toughness that can endure agonies of soul, not body. Their commitment is determination to create more consciousness in the world, but consciousness is rarely welcomed. The exile knows this. They know that seeing clearly and speaking honestly will cost them belonging, comfort, approval. They do it anyway, not out of righteousness, but because remaining unconscious has become more painful than the exile itself. The dark night. Jung emphasized that isolation can be a time of inner purification and change. These periods of solitude become opportunities to return to one's core self, a path toward liberation, allowing spiritual evolution to proceed. But before liberation comes disintegration. Before clarity comes confusion. Before you find your authentic self, you must mourn all the selves you thought you were supposed to be. This is the dark night of individuation, when you've left the comfort of collective consciousness but haven't yet found solid ground in your own. You're floating in liminal space, belonging nowhere, understood by no one. And the hardest part? Recognizing that you can't go back. Consciousness once achieved cannot be undone. The veil once lifted cannot be replaced. The long middle. If the shock of seeing is the beginning and the return is the end, then this is the long middle. The years spent in the wilderness of your own consciousness, learning to be alone with who you actually are. This isn't dramatic. There's no inciting incident, no clear climax, no obvious resolution. It's the dailiness of exile that's most difficult. The accumulation of small disconnections, the weight of holding your tongue in 1,000 conversations, the exhaustion of code switching between your authentic self and your social self, the practice of solitude. Jung emphasized conscientious attention to moods, fantasies, and impulses, attention achieved through meditation, observing the workings of the mind in the present moment. And through practices like journaling, solitude becomes less of a punishment and more of a practice. Not the solitude of lonely isolation, but the solitude of focused self-encounter. You begin to understand the difference between loneliness and aloneness. Loneliness is the feeling of separation despite proximity. Aloneness is the state of being complete in yourself. The exile's journey is learning to transform loneliness into aloneness, to find wholeness within rather than seeking completion through others. Meeting your shadow. Through shadow work, disowned material is brought into consciousness so that we can ultimately accept these traits, impulses, and attributes. But accepting your shadow means accepting that you're not the person you pretended to be for social acceptance. It means acknowledging the anger you've repressed, the desires you've denied, the thoughts you've judged as unacceptable. The exile has time for this work. Too much time, perhaps. In the absence of constant social stimulation and validation, you're forced to confront everything you've been running from. The shadow stops being theoretical and becomes intensely, uncomfortably personal. You discover rage you didn't know you carried, grief that's been waiting years to be felt, shame that's shaped decisions you thought were logical. And because you're alone with it all, there's no escape, no distraction, no one to perform for or hide behind. This is brutal work. It's psychologically analogous to what Jung described as the attempt to free ego consciousness from the deadly grip of the unconscious. The authentic self emerges, but something remarkable happens in this crucible of solitude. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, an authentic self begins to emerge. Not the self you were told to be, not the self that would make you most acceptable, but the self that was always there, buried under layers of conditioning and performance. You start making different decisions. You say no to invitations that used to feel obligatory. You say yes to pursuits that others find strange. You structure your days around what actually matters to you rather than what you think should matter. To others, these choices might look like rebellion or breakdown, but you know differently. You're not rebelling against the world. You're finally aligning with yourself, the gifts hidden in exile. Loneliness can act as a catalyst for individuation, offering an opportunity to make our darkness conscious and transmute it into greater understanding and wisdom, connecting with the self and realizing greater wholeness. The exile discovers gifts that can only be found in solitude, clarity of thought. When you're not constantly managing others' perceptions and expectations, your mind becomes clearer. You can follow thoughts to their natural conclusions without social interruption. You can think dangerous thoughts, uncomfortable thoughts, original thoughts, creative freedom, without the pressure to create what's acceptable or marketable or impressive. Creativity becomes genuinely free. You make art for the sake of making art. You write for the sake of truth rather than approval. Emotional authenticity. You learn what you actually feel versus what you've been conditioned to feel. Anger isn't always bad. Sadness isn't always depression. Joy doesn't require justification. Your emotional life becomes yours again. Spiritual depth. Many exile themselves into the arms of something larger than human consensus. Whether that's nature, God, the cosmos, or what Jung called the self with a capital S. The transcendent becomes more real than the social, unshakable self-knowledge. After years of sitting with yourself, you know who you are. Not who you wish you were or who you're supposed to be, but who you actually are. This knowledge becomes bedrock. It can't be shaken by criticism or flattery because it's been tested in the fires of honest self-encounter. The price remains, but the price doesn't disappear. You've gained these gifts by paying with something precious. Easy belonging, comfortable relationships, the simple pleasure of fitting in. Individuation requires self-sufficiency and the ability to go your own way. This isn't optional. It's not something you can do halfway. Once you start seeing, you can't pretend blindness. Once you start being honest, you can't return to comfortable lies. You become a different kind of person. Stronger in some ways, more vulnerable in others. More authentic but less acceptable. More whole but less included. And there are days, many days, when you wonder if it was worth it. Living between worlds. The exile doesn't actually leave society. They live in it, work in it, may even love people in it. But they live between worlds. Feet in the social sphere, heart in the authentic sphere, mind in the space that bridges both. This duality is exhausting. Code switching isn't just a racial or cultural phenomenon. It's what the exile does constantly. Speaking one language in public, another in private. Performing adequacy while holding truths that would disrupt the performance. You become skilled at translation. You learn to express deep truths in shallow, acceptable language. You learn which audiences can handle which levels of honesty. You learn to protect your inner world while navigating the outer one. This is neither weakness nor dishonesty. It's survival. It's wisdom. It's the hard-won skill of living as a conscious being in a largely unconscious world. The myth promises return, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, equated with Jung's process of individuation, describes transformation of consciousness, the maturing of the human being through tests, trials, and ordeals. In the mythological pattern, the hero descends into the underworld, faces trials, gains treasure or wisdom, and returns transformed to help their community. The exile becomes the wise elder. The outcast becomes the healer. The one who left returns bearing gifts. This is beautiful mythology. But the reality of psychological exile is more complex and less satisfying than the myth suggests. The uncomfortable truth. The truth is, you can't return to where you've never been. And you've never been in the place that everyone else calls home. You realize with crystalline clarity that even before you left, you were never truly there. You were performing presence, not experiencing it. So when you return, when you try to re-engage with old friends, old communities, old ways of being, something fundamental has changed. And it's not just you. You see now that they're still performing the same scripts, still avoiding the same truths, still comfortable in patterns that now feel suffocating to you. You can mime the old behaviors. You can speak the expected words. But authentic return isn't possible because there was never authentic belonging to begin with. The new kind of return. But there is a return, just not the one the myth promised. The return isn't about going back to where you were. It's about bringing who you've become into the world that still exists. It's about integrating your authentic self with your social presence, not perfectly, but more honestly than before. You learn to be in the world without being consumed by it, to participate without losing yourself, to speak truth when possible and hold silence when necessary, to find the rare souls who can meet you in authentic space while accepting that most cannot and will not. The return means accepting that you'll live in two modes, the shallow but necessary social mode, and the deep but rare authentic mode. You stop expecting depth everywhere and start treasuring it where you find it, finding your tribe or not. Sometimes in the return you find other exiles, other people who've done their own shadow work, paid their own price for consciousness, learned their own hard lessons about authenticity. These connections are different. There's no small talk, no performance, no careful management of impression. You can speak the language of truth because you're both fluent in it. These friendships, partnerships, collaborations feel like water in a desert. But they're rare, vanishingly rare, and that's okay, because you've learned that one genuine connection is worth 1,000 superficial ones. That being truly known by 3 people is more valuable than being casually liked by 300. For some exiles, the tribe is never found. This isn't tragedy. Jung wrote that individuation does not isolate, it connects. But he was talking about connection to the self, to the unconscious, to something transpersonal and eternal, not necessarily to other people, creating what's missing. The most powerful return isn't about finding your place in existing structures. It's about creating new ones. The exile who has done the work often becomes the one who builds spaces where authentic connection is possible. They create art that tells uncomfortable truths. They write books that validate others' lonely journeys. They build communities structured around honesty rather than performance. They don't do this from missionary zeal or savior complex. They do it because they needed these spaces and they didn't exist, so they built them. They do it because the loneliness taught them exactly what kind of connection they were missing. The integrated exile. The mature return looks like integration. You're no longer torn between authentic self and social self because you've learned to be authentically yourself within social contexts. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. You attend the family dinner and participate without losing yourself. You work the job without selling your soul. You engage in small talk without despising yourself for it, recognizing it as social lubrication rather than existential betrayal. But you also protect your solitude fiercely. You maintain your practices. You guard your inner world. You know that integration doesn't mean dissolution. It means being able to move between worlds without losing your center. The wound becomes the gift. The commitment is to create more consciousness in the world. Your wound, the isolation, the loneliness, the painful awakening, becomes your gift. Not because pain is noble, but because you've transformed it into wisdom. You can help others through their dark nights because you've survived your own. You can validate their loneliness because yours taught you it's part of the path. You can assure them they're not broken because you learned you weren't either. And sometimes, in rare, precious moments, you meet someone earlier on the path and you can offer what no one offered you. The knowledge that what they're experiencing isn't madness or failure, but transformation. That the loneliness means they're doing the work. That the exile isn't punishment but passage, the permanent liminality. But here's the final truth the myth doesn't tell you. The return isn't a destination. It's a permanent liminality. You don't return to unconscious belonging because that's no longer possible. You don't remain in total isolation because that's not sustainable. You exist in the space between not quite insider, not quite outsider, not fully alone, not fully belonging, and eventually you make peace with this. The threshold becomes home. The liminal space becomes your ground. You realize that this uncomfortable in-between is exactly where conscious humans have always lived. What was actually lost? Let's be honest about what the exile loses. It's not small. It's not nothing. You lose the easy laughter of unconscious belonging, the simple pleasure of agreeing with everyone, the warm comfort of fitting in without trying, the uncomplicated joy of participating in rituals that feel meaningful to everyone around you. You lose the protection of the collective, the validation of the group, the sense that you're part of something larger that understands and accepts you. These losses are real. Grieving them isn't weakness. Acknowledging them isn't failure, what was actually gained. But here's what you gain: yourself, not the self you were supposed to be. Not the self that would make others comfortable, but the self that was always there, waiting to be discovered beneath layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear. You gain the ability to make decisions from your own center rather than from fear of others' judgment. You gain creative freedom, emotional authenticity, spiritual depth. You gain the capacity for genuine connection rather than pleasant performance. You gain sight. And yes, sight includes seeing things you wish you couldn't see. But it also means seeing beauty that others miss, truth that others avoid, depth that others never access. The lonely become the luminous. There's a strange alchemy that happens in the exile's journey. The very loneliness that seemed like curse becomes capacity. The isolation that felt like punishment becomes preparation. The darkness that threatened to consume you becomes the womb of your rebirth. People who've done this work have a quality. You can feel it. They're more present, more real, more themselves. There's no performance, no facade, no carefully managed impression. What you see is what there is. And paradoxically, this authenticity often draws people in even as it sets them apart. They're comfortable with silence, comfortable with discomfort, comfortable with being misunderstood because they understand themselves. This isn't enlightenment. It's not perfection. It's integration. It's wholeness. It's the peace that comes from knowing who you are and being willing to be that person, even if it costs you belonging. Permission to be lonely. If you're lonely on this path, you have permission to acknowledge it. You don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. You don't have to gaslight yourself into believing isolation is the same as integration, but you also have permission to trust that the loneliness means something, that it's not random suffering or cosmic punishment, that it's part of the process of becoming whole in a world that often rewards remaining fragmented. Loneliness can act as a catalyst for individuation, offering an opportunity to make our darkness conscious and transmute it into greater understanding. The loneliness won't be constant. It will come in waves, in seasons, in phases. Sometimes you'll feel it acutely. Sometimes you'll barely notice it. But it will be your companion on this journey, teaching you lessons that no other teacher could, to those still sleeping. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in these words, know this: you're not broken. You're not defective. You're not missing some crucial ability to just fit in and be happy like everyone else seems to be. You're waking up, and waking up hurts. It's supposed to hurt. Growth hurts. Shedding skin hurts. Being born hurts. But on the other side of this pain is something precious: the ability to live as yourself rather than as a performance of what others expect. The capacity for genuine connection rather than comfortable pretense. The freedom to make choices based on your own truth rather than collective consensus. The invitation. This path isn't for everyone. Most people will never take it, and that's perfectly fine. There's nothing superior about consciousness if it brings only suffering. There's nothing noble about exile if it leads nowhere. But for those who can't go back to sleep, for those who've seen and cannot unsee, for those who feel the call toward authenticity even as they fear its cost, know that you're not alone in your aloneness. The exile is an ancient archetype because it's an essential one. Every generation needs people willing to step outside collective consciousness, to see what others cannot or will not see, to speak truths that disrupt comfortable illusions. Not because those truths will be welcomed, not because the exile will be rewarded, but because consciousness itself demands it, because wholeness requires it, because becoming who you truly are, despite the cost, is the privilege of a lifetime. The final truth, the cost of waking up is everything that isn't you. But what remains, what survives the fire of transformation, the loneliness of individuation, the pain of becoming conscious, is finally, authentically, irrevocably yours, and perhaps that's worth it after all, not because the path is easy, not because the loneliness disappears, but because living as yourself, even in exile, beats performing for acceptance in a world that never truly knew you anyway. The gift of conscious loneliness is this: you become a sovereign nation of one. You learn to find home in yourself. You discover that the belonging you were seeking was never out there. It was always here, waiting for you to become whole enough to recognize it. This is the cost of waking up. This is also the gift.